The morning mist clung to the hills, drifting lazily into a valley where a sleepy village began to wake. Smoke curled from chimneys, blending with the scent of dew-soaked earth and wood fires. In the distance, a dog barked faintly, its sound barely breaking the serene silence. Shadows of the mountain. Chia was new to the village, and her arrival was met with curious glances and tentative smiles. As a teacher, she came armed with little more than a quiet determination and an unwavering belief in the power of education. Sitting at her humble desk, her delicate, calloused hands gripped a simple pen as she crafted her first lesson plan. The flickering bulb above cast a soft light on the reused paper in front of her, which was marked with faded notes, a testament to her resourcefulness. Every word she wrote was a step toward the future she was determined to build in this unfamiliar place. As Chia stepped onto the village path, children darted past her, their laughter echoing like ripples on water. She adjusted the basket of books in her hand, glancing at them with a small smile before turning her attention back to the uneven dirt road. Behind closed doors, whispers carried on the wind, fragments of adults speaking in hushed tones about topics she would rather not hear. Cow leaned casually against the weathered wooden fence, the morning sun casting uneven light across his face, one side aglow, the other veiled in shadow. His stance was loose, almost indifferent, yet the tight line of his mouth and the furrow in his brow betrayed a storm of unspoken thoughts. As Chia passed by, her gaze focused straight ahead, Cow's eyes lingered on her, following her every step until she vanished down the path. Inside the schoolhouse, Chia stood behind Nia, watching as his pencil hovered hesitantly over his workbook. The boy's brows were furrowed in concentration as he tried to solve the problem in front of him, his lips moving silently with each calculation. Around them, other students whispered in low voices, their attention flitting between each other and something unseen beneath their desks. Chia's eyes darted to a corner of the room where a group of boys was passing a note furtively. She sighed softly and then returned her gaze to Nia, who had just erased his work for the third time. "Take your time," she whispered, her voice steady. "You're doing fine." In a dimly lit room at the center of the village, Mr. Suvanikhun, the village chief, leaned back in his creaking wooden chair, his fingers lazily counting through a stack of crisp bills. A self-satisfied smirk curved his lips as he glanced at the bribe money on the desk before him. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint scent of stale tobacco. A clock on the wall ticked methodically, its sound amplified in the stillness. The small, smug flicker in his eye hinted at the power he wielded, corrupt, pervasive, and inescapable. Nia crouched behind a wooden shutter, his breathing shallow and rapid. Through the narrow slats, he could see men in uniform kicking down a neighbor's door. The muffled shouting grew louder, punctuated by the sounds of splintering wood and shattering glass. Nia's eyes widened, and his fingers gripped the edge of the window until his knuckles turned white. A sharp cry rang out, sending a jolt through him. He turned away, his heart pounding, and sank to the floor, covering his ears to block out the noise. Tu was the only policeman in the village, a figure who commanded both respect and quiet scrutiny. Standing at the edge of the settlement, his crisp uniform identified him as the law in a place where order frequently gave way to uncertainty. The sinking sun framed his silhouette against the dense forest, creating a stark contrast with the fiery hues of the horizon. His hands rested on his hips, projecting calm authority, but his tense jaw and flickering gaze revealed the weight he carried, torn between his duty to the village and the complexities of his own heart. Deep in the woods, Chia and Cow sat on a fallen log, their backs barely touching. Chia stared at the ground, gripping her knees as she spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't what we dreamed of," she said quietly. Cow didn't respond immediately. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and exhaled sharply. "It's not that simple, Chia," he murmured, his voice low and edged with frustration. He glanced at her, his expression softening when he saw the pain in her eyes. The space between them felt vast, a rift carved by choices they couldn't seem to bridge. In a secluded shack hidden among dense trees, Cow sat at a battered table illuminated by the dim glow of a single lantern. Across from him, a shadowy figure slid a small package toward him. The air was tense, thick with unspoken threats and silent agreements. Cao hesitated for a brief moment before placing a wad of cash on the table. The faint sound of the money being counted was the only noise as the two men exchanged a brief, knowing glance before retreating back into the shadows of the night. Chia stood frozen by the doorway of her family's small home. Her mother's voice, low and urgent, filtered through the thin walls as she spoke with a neighbor. "She's too stubborn," her mother said, her tone a mix of worry and frustration. "The path she's on, it's dangerous." Chia's breath hitched, and she took a step back, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. She steadied herself, her hands clenching into fists as her mother's words echoed in her mind. In the schoolyard, children chased after a deflated soccer ball, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Chia watched from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. On the edges of the yard, a small group of older boys huddled under the shade of a tree. Their hushed voices carried just enough for her to catch snippets, whispers of money, quick exchanges of folded paper. Chia's stomach tightened, and she turned away, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tu and Chia stood on the schoolhouse steps, their voices rising as they argued. "You're too naive," Tu said, his tone sharp and his hands gesturing emphatically. "This isn't a fight you can win." Chia's jaw tightened as she stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "And what are you doing? Looking the other way? Letting him destroy our home?" Tu flinched but held his ground, the tension between them crackling like a storm about to break. From above, the village appeared to be in a state of chaos. Families rushed in every direction, clutching their belongings as police officers moved systematically from house to house. Shouts and cries filled the air, merging into a cacophony of fear and confusion. Smoke rose from a small fire near the square, with curling tendrils vanishing into the sky as the raid continued relentlessly. Cao stood at the edge of a cliff, the valley stretching endlessly before him. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, but he barely noticed. His shoulders slumped, and his head hung low, his figure silhouetted against the brilliant horizon. The wind tugged at his clothes, carrying with it the faint hum of the village below, a distant reminder of a life he felt slipping further from his grasp. Under a desk in the schoolhouse, a pair of small hands exchanged a folded bag quickly and subtly. Nia glanced nervously over his shoulder, his movements stiff and hesitant. The recipient, a boy no older than him, tucked the package into his pocket with practiced ease, his expression calm. The murmur of lessons continued in the background, Chia's voice steady but distant, completely unaware of the silent transaction taking place just a few feet away. The path was barely visible in the dim light, but Chia didn't hesitate as she ran, her breath sharp and labored. She had learned of Nia's arrest just minutes before, prompting her to sprint through the narrow streets of the village. Shadows flickered across the walls as lanterns swayed in the wind. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the distant sound of angry voices grew louder with each step she took. In the chief's office, Mr. Suvanikhun hovered over Chia, his thick hands pressed against the desk as he leaned forward. His voice was low but laced with menace. "You don't understand how things work here," he said, narrowing his eyes. Chia sat up straight, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. The dim light cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the smirk that twisted his lips. She refused to look away. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. Rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking the ground until it turned into a slick, muddy mess. Cao knelt before Nia, his clothes drenched and clinging to his skin. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking as he bowed his head. Nia stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his expression torn between anger and disbelief. The rain poured relentlessly, masking the tears that streaked down Cao's face. In the dim glow of a single candle, Chia sat hunched over a desk piled high with papers. Her hands moved methodically as she sifted through documents and scribbled notes. Each page seemed to confirm her suspicions, and her resolve strengthened with every damning piece of evidence. The faint flicker of the flame caught her gaze, illuminating the determination that burned within her. A crowd had gathered in the village square, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns swaying in the breeze. Chia stood at the center, her voice steady as she revealed the truth, piece by piece. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as she exposed Mr. Suvarnakawan's corruption. The chief stood at the edge of the group, his face pale and taut. His confident smirk had been replaced by an uneasy expression, scowl. Tu gripped Kao's wrists tightly as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place. For a moment, they stood face to face, their breaths heavy and uneven. Tu's expression was unreadable, yet his grip remained firm. Kao's gaze flickered. A mix of anger and resignation flashed in his eyes. The space between them felt dense with unspoken words, the weight of their shared past hanging over them like a looming cloud. The classroom was eerily silent, with rows of desks neatly arranged as if waiting for students who would never arrive. Chia sat alone at her desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the chalkboard, but her thoughts wandered elsewhere, drifting to memories of laughter and voices that once filled the room. The emptiness pressed in around her, a stark reminder of everything that had been lost. The first light of dawn bathed the new village in soft, golden hues. A newly built community center stood at its heart, its doors wide open. Children ran toward it with bright smiles, their laughter breaking the stillness of the early morning. Chia stood by the entrance, her heart swelling as she watched the scene unfold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh grass and new beginnings. High on a hill overlooking the bustling village, Chia stood still with her arms crossed loosely in front of her. Below, the community center was buzzing with activity, children were playing, and families were engaged in quiet conversations. As the sun rose higher in the sky, it cast warm light over the valley. A faint smile touched her lips as she took a deep breath. Slowly, she turned and walked away, with the horizon stretching infinitely ahead of her, a symbol of the future she had fought so hard to create.